How are we doing? Woo, good morning. Welcome. Welcome to folks who are here in person. Welcome to folks who are tuning in on Zoom. We're grateful that you're starting your Tuesday with us. Today's panel is exploring the state's growing role in anti-displacement and preservation work. My name's Justine Marcus. I'm the Senior State and Local Policy Director with Enterprise Community Partners in our Northern California office. If at any time you have trouble hearing me, thank you, or hearing any of our panelists, just maybe do a little raise the roof sign so we know. It's a little tricky with the mask to understand how close we should be to the mic. So just thanks in advance for your patience with us. This is a big deal to be at this conference together. It's really great to see everyone. It's a lot of new things, so do what you need to do. If you need to take a step out, if you need to use the restroom, get some air, we just encourage you to make yourselves comfortable and enjoy the panel today. So thanks again for being here. You're fine. Take a seat. Get comfortable. Great. We're going to wait for a few more folks to trickle in. Awesome. Cool. So for many people, including myself, local efforts around addressing housing insecurity, preventing neighbors, loved ones from being displaced from their homes is kind of the first entry point into housing work, and later we kind of discover the affordable housing field that brings us all together here at this conference. And that's really what I want to ground the conversation in today, because I think those challenges are what's bringing a lot of us to this conference, bringing a lot of us to this panel in particular today. It's those challenges and those risks, right? The risk of not being able to stay in your neighborhood, where your jobs are, where your schools are, where your resources are. It's that risk of having fewer choices when it comes to looking for a place to live, and the risk of being displaced and not having any alternative. So we're going to talk about some of those challenges today, but we're really going to focus also on the leadership that has emerged from these challenges. And that's why I'm really excited to have 4 really fantastic leaders on this panel today. We're going to focus on how local organizations, local elected officials, community members have taken action to address these challenges in their communities, and consider together, and I do mean together all of us, how the state is supporting that work and complementing and supporting that work that's been happening locally. So I'm excited to be moderating this session today. I'll introduce our panelists in a moment, but I do want to also say that we hope to include all of you in this discussion. We know you're also leaders in your own communities, many of you kind of on the front lines of doing this type of anti-displacement and preservation work. So today our focus is housing preservation, specifically the acquisition and preservation of what we call kind of unsubsidized affordable housing. Some folks call it naturally occurring affordable housing. And according to some of the most recent data from our friends at California Housing Partnership, we have well over 1 million of these unsubsidized affordable homes right now across the state. And what this means is, as we're working really hard to produce new affordable housing, we're also facing a pretty steady and growing loss of this other important kind of class of affordable housing due to rising rents, eviction, and other forms of displacement. And so acquisition rehab, actually acquiring these properties off the private market and stewarding them as affordable housing into perpetuity, has become more and more a strategy that folks are looking towards, kind of this 2 birds, 1 seed strategy, where we can protect residents today who are living in these homes and make sure that they can stay there as long as they would like to, while at the same time expanding the supply of affordable housing for generations to come. I know I'm speaking to the choir a little bit, to many of you who are deep in this work. And we've seen this as a key kind of place-based strategy, and in many places with an explicit focus on addressing racial equity and providing permanent stability for people of color who are disproportionately impacted by housing insecurity. So we've got local affordable housing developers, CDCs, CLTs, and others kind of slowly working to acquire these properties. It's not easy work, as many of our panelists will discuss. And at Enterprise, we've definitely been growing our focus on acquisition rehab. Many of my fantastic colleagues on the program side have been really deep on the technical assistance and capacity building. I have my colleagues on the capital side who have been working on actually deploying funds and doing the kind of capital provision for these deals. And that direct work is kind of what's empowered me as our policy person to try to socialize this idea and grow momentum for this strategy in Sacramento at the state level. And the only way that we can do that is really in partnership with a lot of other organizations, including many of you who are in the audience today. One of the primary ways that we've done that is through the Stable Homes Coalition, which we co-lead with our hosts, Housing California, thank you, shout out to Housing California, and Public Advocates, which we'll hear more about from our panelists. And it's brought together a coalition that is asking the same kinds of questions that we at Enterprise were asking, which is, how can we grow this work that's happening locally? How can we take that proof of concept and bring it to more significant scale? But also, how can we make ACT Rehab a feasible and accessible strategy in more communities? So it's not just kind of high capacity local jurisdictions that have a lot of resources to throw around, but it's accessible to any community for which that strategy would be beneficial for its residents. And that's why we're here, talking about what the state can do, how the state can build on those local successes, what it's currently doing, what more the state could do. And because I work in policy, we're definitely going to talk about some very specific budget and legislative opportunities that we're hoping you can channel some of your energy and enthusiasm that comes out of this panel into directly. So with that kind of framing in mind, I have the pleasure of introducing our panelists today. Each of our panelists will be making a presentation so you can learn a little bit more about their work, after which we'll have some time for discussion amongst the panelists and with all of you, some time to ask and answer questions. So immediately to my right is Andres Ramos with Public Advocates. Andres joined Public Advocates in February of 2021, where he works on issues relating to housing justice, including affordable housing, fair housing, and renters' rights. Prior to joining Public Advocates, Andres worked for the Office of the Legislative Counsel, where he drafted legislation for members of the California legislature and provided advice to legislators and legislative staff on constitutional issues and other legal matters. He's passionate about advocating for the needs of disadvantaged communities and has channeled that passion into activism and advocacy at both the state and local levels. Andres and I have been in Zoom meetings for the last almost year and a half, and this is the first day we're meeting in person. So I'm very excited about that. Next, we have Stephanie Reyes. She's with HCD. She's a housing finance specialist with the California Department of Housing and Community Development in their Division of State Financial Assistance. Stephanie has over 15 years of experience in policy research, program design, and advocacy in the housing field. Most recently, she was the state and local policy manager at Grounded Solutions Network, a national membership organization that promotes housing solutions that will stay affordable for generations. And then we have Debbie Chen. Debbie is with Little Tokyo Service Center. She's their director of real estate. She's responsible for overseeing Little Tokyo Service Center's real estate development activities and developing the pipeline of future projects. She's been the project lead on more than $400 million worth of mixed-use and affordable housing projects. It's really impressive, and has overseen real estate projects through all phases of development. Previously, she was senior project manager, and before that, project manager at Little Tokyo Service Center. She's also worked as a project manager in Boston and received her bachelor's degree in economics from Wesley College and her master's from Harvard University. And finally, we have Roberto Garcia Ceballos. He's with Fideicomiso Comunitario Tierra Libre. He's an LA-based or Tongva land-based community and cultural organizer and strategist. He was born in Mexico City and raised in San Jose, California. He's the co-founder of two community-based organizations, one being Fideicomiso Comunitario Libre y Community Power Collective, that work together to build collective land stewardship, community power building, and cultural vitality. Please join me in welcoming our panelists, and I am going to have Roberto kick us off with the presentations.
Can everybody hear me? All right. Hey, everyone. Good morning. My name is Roberto, and I'm going to be talking about Fideicomiso Comunitario Tierra Libre's work, but I'll also be talking about the LACOT Coalition, which is a coalition of 5 community land trusts that's growing in LA, and we're all community people of color-led or BIPOC-led organizations. 3 of us were formed pre-pandemic, and we're really built out to kind of respond to what we saw happen during this health and economic crisis. And so I'm going to lay out some of the landscape of what's happening in LA and how that's influencing policy today at a state level. And so I'll just, before I get into my slides, Fideicomiso Comunitario Tierra Libre was founded in 2019. Pre-pandemic, it was a community-led effort to really address displacement and expand our definition of affordability and affordable housing in our communities. Specifically around not just having light-tech housing being built in our communities, which we appreciate, but we also needed we needed an answer around how do we have community control over land, and how do we have expand permanent affordability in our communities beyond protected covenants for 15 to 30 or 50 years. And so those were like some of the questions that we were engaging as a community, not so much as like affordable housing developers, but as like local people in the neighborhood, having real concern about their permanence or their being able to like live in Boyle Heights and East LA. And so our way of addressing it was like, let's form a community land trust. Let's create more, expand decision-making and community engagement and input and participation of our community by having a community land trust that could really help us be a tool to facilitate those things, working with community development corporations, working with public agencies, and working amongst each other as neighbors and as community members. And so when the pandemic actually hit, there was a lot of us that were really concerned. And one of the biggest concerns is like, how are people going to stay in their homes if they're not being able to pay rent? And so, you know, there was a lot of advocacy around tenant protections in terms of for tenants. But one of the other things we saw is that there was a lot of buildings being put on the market. And a lot of those buildings were not being, they wouldn't stay on the market for more than 3 months. And that's really fast. For us, for us, it was like, okay, well, we know federal funding is going to come into the neighborhood. We know federal funding is coming to LA. So how do we organize ourselves? How do we build coalitions? And how do we actually start strategizing to make sure that these funds help us stabilize the neighborhood, specifically in making sure that these these buildings that are being sold stay in the community. And they don't go to like a corporate landlord, or they don't go to a landlord whose intention is to buy the building, flip it during the pandemic, and who knows where our neighbors are going to go. So long story short, the federal funding never came. But we formed really great coalitions, and the CLTs built partnerships with community development corporations, and we convinced the county to allocate funds from the Affordable Housing Trust Fund at the county level to give us funding to buy buildings. And among the 5 COTs, we were able to split $14 million and acquire small multifamilies at risk of being displaced. And so, and the way we talked about it is, one, like, we all know COVID-19 worsened the LA housing crisis, and the folks most at risk were tenants, very low income tenants. We knew that NOAA properties are very distressed. Like, you know, some of the, and Debbie will talk about our acquisition. You know, it's like 100-year-old buildings who've only been used to squeeze rent out of tenants, haven't been preserved, haven't been stabilized, like have electrical wiring from like the 1920s, like things like really bad situations that people are living under. And we all know from the last housing crisis from the 2008 to 2000 period that the corporate landlords are waiting for opportunities to take over rental properties. And so, and another thing is, which was one of the reasons we founded the Community Land Trust, is that covenants expire, and then what happens to that housing? Like, who's engaging in the neighborhood around those conversations? And how do we localize that? And how do we create that as a common conversation among neighbors, that there's an affordable housing building that's gonna lose covenants in 5 and 10 years and 15 years? And as we look at the numbers, we know that that's rising, specifically in LA. And so for us, we created 2 specific programs with the county. One, we created a Chapter 8 program where $1 million were allocated for us to acquire their property tax foreclosures. And so we're working to develop that pilot program. It's actually taking a lot longer to implement because we don't want anyone to be foreclosed on, specifically now. But the other program that we developed was the $14 million CLT pilot program, where 5 CLTs shared grant money, $14 million, to acquire small multifamily properties. Fidecomissa was able to acquire an 11-unit building. And the way we went about it is that we were already organizing in the neighborhood. We were already going to the buildings that were being sold and letting tenants know that their building was being sold, that they had rights, that if the building were to be transferred to another owner, they could stay and they could actually fight to not be displaced in case their building was being flipped. And so the Simmons building, which we like to reference, is one of those buildings. We had done some flyering, we had done some know your rights work, and so that allowed us to have really clear information that was a very good building to acquire and preserve in East LA. And so that's a little bit of LA. So the Simmons building is just one example. There's actually 8 other buildings that we were able to acquire, and we're about to hit 60 units of preserved affordable housing within 1 year of the pilot program. And the buildings are all located in at-risk neighborhoods in terms of displacement, and they're located in concentrated areas where people of color live, low-income people of color live. So South LA, South Central, Koreatown, East LA, Boyle Heights. So for us, it's a program that really comes from the grassroots in terms of organizing, in terms of making sure that we're creating anti-displacement strategies, even though we know that the federal funding or the state funding is going to be coming down the pipeline eventually. But for us, it was like, we need to have a proactive approach to this. And we need to prove that it's viable to preserve and implement an anti-displacement strategy. And so we were able to find the funds, and we were able to implement a pilot program that we're hoping stays as a core piece of LA County. And so I'll turn it over to Debbie to talk more about our acquisition.
Good morning, everybody. So Roberto and I have been working together, I suppose, since 2020, these last 2 years, and I'm here to tell you a little bit about how we got both this LA County pilot program done, and the $14 million approved for the county, but also to just talk a little bit more about our acquisition rehab and how we got that done. And I just want to say, to Justine's point, before these two programs we helped develop in the county, there were no good answers for preservation dollars and generally speaking funding programs in LA County and elsewhere. And it's true, preservation is a painstaking process, and always has been, because there's been no good answer for that funding. However, to Roberto's point, we got it done. We got 60 units in a year and a half time off the market, and these were, for the most part, NOAA properties. We were searching on the market. At one point, we were, Roberto, we were looking around your house to acquire property, and we received word that one of the I think it was like a fourplex, was going to go on the market. And we saw the brochure, and within a week's time, we discovered that it actually had already gone under escrow. So this was the pace of real estate speculation, investment, properties getting snatched up in Boyle Heights and in East Los Angeles. And we knew, and it really came from the ground up, that emphasis to the county that time was of the essence. And I think to get that done, I think that's where Little Tokyo Service Center helped to come in. Just a little bit about our organization. So we started out as a service provider in the 1970s, and we became a community development, affordable housing development organization starting around the early 90s. So several of our clients, they were senior clients. They didn't speak any English. They were living in affordable housing, and they actually received eviction notices one day, and they didn't know what they were looking at, so they brought them to the office, and they asked the social workers to translate for them. When we discovered they were getting evicted, that's when Little Tokyo Service Center really jumped into action, helped to organize a campaign, and we ended up acquiring that property. And to this day, we still preserve the affordability in perpetuity. At this point, I think we've done about 1,000 units of affordable housing in our portfolio. But for the most part, these projects, they were all done in partnership with other community-based organizations. We do build not just in the neighborhood of Little Tokyo and Los Angeles. We also, it's integral to our mission to help build capacity, build community in other communities of color, BIPOC communities, and I would say we've partnered with maybe more than 24 organizations at this point to really help do that work. Fidecomissa is one example of that. Coalition for Responsible Community Development in South Los Angeles. Don't know if they're here today. No. Filipino Worker Center in historic Filipino town. And just another one, Koreatown Immigrant Workers Alliance in K-Town. So, this has really been how we have done the work for the past few decades. And this property that we're looking at, this is an acquisition of a NOAA, a naturally occurring affordable housing site. There are 11 units in this 2-building property, and do I have a profile on there? That's just pictures of ourselves. And like Roberto said, this building was actually originally built in the 1930s, And the tenants, a lot of them have been, living in substandard conditions. They've been on the cusp of eviction. And in many ways, we saw this program as homelessness prevention as well, and we were able to mobilize quickly to help, save the 10 families in these 11 units from, ending up on the streets. And for the most part, since we've acquired the property, we've really undertaken a large-scale rehab as well for the site to help people so they can stay in the building for perpetuity, or as long as they wish. A lot of our tenants have been there for more than 10 years at this point. So nobody wants to go anywhere. Everybody wants to continue to stay and raise their families here. I think one other thing to note is in terms of our partnership with fidecomissa, it's been, there's, as two community-based organizations, and this being a CDC CLT partnership, there's a long history between not just our organizations and individuals in it, but also our neighborhoods. And I think, this relationship was really something that we were able to build through LTSC's experience in partnering as well. From the beginning, there was a pretty straightforward MOU to help outline our roles and responsibilities between the two organizations. And I think, like Roberto was saying, fidecomissa really took on a lot of that initial work, organizing, working directly with tenants, and LTSC has done a lot of the work, on the acquisition closing process, the rehab, as well as the asset management and property management. But for the most part, it's really been, a group effort, and hopefully you feel the same way. It's been a real capacity building exercise and helping fidecomissa. And our plan is in a couple years' time, we do want to transfer full ownership of the site. Right now it's co-owned by our two organizations, but we intend to fully transfer ownership to the Community Land Trust. And at that point in time, there will also be a split between the land and the improvements. So the land will continue to be owned fully by the Community Land Trust, and the property, and this is something we've been working closely with the residents on as well, will be converted into a limited equity cooperative where the tenants in there will have fractional ownership shares, and they will collectively govern that structure. So that's just a little bit about oh, I did apologize. I did have another slide. Yeah, so I think I've talked a little bit about the property as well. This is just a little bit about the property. I think one thing I will also note is, we also got it done because it was relatively cost effective. I think for the most part, it is more cost effective to keep people who are already there in their homes housed than it is for them to fall into homelessness and to try to find new units, or overall speaking, cheaper to building something from anew. And we did get this done for under $250,000 per unit, and really made the dollars work among the 5 organizations for that $14 million program. So hopefully the state has taken inspiration from some of our work at the local level. I'll let Stephanie speak a little bit to that. I think we're really proud of what we've accomplished in the last year and a half. More than 60 units, and every single life is so tangible, and it's something that we hope will stay there and have a ripple effect for generations to come.
Before we move on to Stephanie, I just wanted to create a moment if folks want to try to grab any of the empty seats. I know we just have a number of folks who are standing, so just feel free to move, and if you have an empty seat near you and you want to let folks know it's there, please go ahead and do so, as many folks comfortable as possible. Another round of applause for Debbie and Roberto. Awesome. And we will hand it over to Stephanie.
Okay, well, you guys hear me okay? Okay, great. Well, Debbie was right. That is a perfect segue into what I'm going to talk about today, which is an upcoming, forthcoming, still under development new state program really for this kind of small site acquisition and rehab that Roberto and Debbie were describing. The program is called the Foreclosure Intervention Housing Preservation Program, which we affectionately refer to as FIPP. And before I get into some program details, I'll just start with sort of what was the inspiration for this new program, which was back when the pandemic started. A lot of people thought, wow, you know, this is going to have huge economic impacts, which indeed, of course, we have seen, which could, among other things, lead to a wave of foreclosed properties, both owner-occupied properties and also rental properties, particularly small rental properties. And folks were remembering some of the outcomes from the last foreclosure crisis back in the 2008 timeframe, right? When we saw lots of real estate investment companies purchasing distressed properties at foreclosure auction or before, and then either leaving those properties vacant or turning home ownership units into rental units, or jacking up the rents on rental units when the market allowed that. So there was a thought, well, can we get ahead of that and not see that happen again? So this property here on this page is 2928 Magnolia Street in West Oakland, which was purchased by Wedgwood, a real estate investment firm, at a foreclosure auction. What's the address again? 2928 Magnolia in West Oakland. And so what do we want to see instead, right? In terms of, we brought this bringing up this program, the folks who were suggesting this program. Well, to continue the story of 2928 Magnolia, some of you may recognize this property as a property that 4 Black mothers in Oakland occupied to make a statement about the problematic nature of real estate investment companies leaving homes vacant while families are facing homelessness. And because of that brave action and the subsequent media attention, Wedgwood ultimately agreed to sell this property to the Oakland Community Land Trust, a community-driven, community-based organization, to maintain that property as long-term affordable housing to serve the residents of West Oakland. And that is the outcome that we really want to see from FIPP, but of course without the intermediate step of the real estate investment firm, right? We want to see distressed properties moving into the hands of responsible, community-driven, community-based organizations as long-term affordable housing. So I have a few slides about the enabling legislation for this program. There are actually 2 related laws. One is Senate Bill 1079, which is kind of what I've been calling a right of last refusal kind of bill, where tenants and prospective owner-occupants and nonprofits have this 45-day window after a foreclosure auction to purchase 1 to 4 unit properties at or above the last and highest bid. Great opportunity, but did not come with any funding to do this work. And folks who've been trying to do this type of work know that there is pretty much no other funding out there to do this work. So a year later, the Foreclosure Intervention Housing Preservation Program signed into law along with a $500 million budget allocation. And this program is really to support nonprofits to acquire and rehabilitate buildings either at risk of foreclosure or in the foreclosure process. And in order to enable fast acquisitions, which you heard Debbie and Roberto talking about how important that is, HCD is going to be contracting with some outside nonprofit lenders to manage the program and get funds out the door. So I mentioned properties that are eligible for this program for funding. Properties at risk of foreclosure, you can see some of the indicators of foreclosure risk on this slide. Those are buildings from 1 unit to 25 units in size that are not currently owner occupied. And then properties that are in the foreclosure process have received a notice of default. Those are again 1 to 25 unit properties. And then finally, properties that are eligible for that SB 1079 post-auction acquisition, those 1 to 4 unit properties. And again, this program is primarily intended for nonprofits to acquire these properties. You can see the list here. It's also open to tenants who will likely work with a nonprofit and to public agencies. And then thinking about kind of the anti-displacement side of this program, one of the really wonderful pieces of the legislation is that it says, if a nonprofit acquires a property, when those units become vacant, they then need to income qualify future occupants for those units, although the legislation is very broad, so properties can serve anyone from extremely low income all the way up to moderate income households. But when the units are acquired, you don't need to do income certification of those tenants. The idea is to keep those tenants in their homes until a unit is vacated. And there are strong affordability requirements. Most properties will have, both ownership and rental will have to be affordable for at least 55 years. Some ownership properties, at least 30 years. So that's pretty much what's in the legislation. And then I was hired by HCD in mid-October of last year to really kind of bring up this program and figure out how to make it work on the ground. So I've been doing that for the past few months. And the first thing I did was start to talk to people and ask them what is needed to make this program really work on the ground. So I know this slide is not very readable, but there are several of my fellow panelists and folks out in the audience are all folks who I've been talking to. And I heard kind of two very big picture pieces of feedback with some sub pieces of feedback. One big message was this program is and will need to be pretty different from a lot of at least HCD's typical affordable housing funding programs. A lot of our programs, not all, but many are focused on new construction. This is not new construction. To the extent that we have preservation programs, they often focus on preserving the affordability of properties that already have restrictive covenants. This is about unsubsidized affordable housing. A lot of our programs are to serve large properties, tend to be mostly rental, tend to provide just one type of financing, and none of that is going to be the case for FIPP. So we're charting some new ground, which is very exciting and interesting and challenging. And then the other big piece of feedback I heard a lot was that capital to do these deals is absolutely needed and has been totally lacking. So $500 million is very welcome. But capital alone will not be enough to make sure this program succeeds. And we also need to do some other things. So we talked already about the need to get money out the door to project sponsors very fast, right? So they can compete with investors who are going after these properties. So we're working on different ways to make sure that happens. We also need to make sure that our program actually meets the capital needs of distressed properties in varied markets. So Roberto was talking about, you have 100-year-old electrical wiring, right? That's going to be very expensive to rehab. We have to recognize that we need to invest in these properties to make them safe and quality places for people to be living. That's going to cost some money. And in varied markets, there are markets where acquisition of an existing property because of land prices, even if the property is in terrible condition, is very expensive. So we need to take that into account. We also need to make sure that project sponsors have the capacity to succeed and to use these funds and do what we want to see happen. A lot of the folks HCD works with on these big new construction rental properties, tax credit properties, the Bridge Housings and EAH and Mercy Housings, they're probably not going to be doing this work, right? It's going to be groups like Roberto's and Debbie's who are doing this work. And because there has not been much funding to date to do these kinds of projects, there aren't that many folks who have been doing them. So we recognize that we need to invest in technical assistance, direct capacity building grants to organizations, make sure that folks can really run with these funds and succeed. And we need to make sure we're supporting project sponsors who are rooted in communities of color and implementing community ownership models. And so that's partially the capacity building I was talking about, and also making sure the program works, right, for these models, and making sure that we're designing for, to make sure that we can have cooperative ownership and those other types of things in our legal documents. And we need to ensure that projects can genuinely support low-income residents of color. And among other things, that means making sure that if you're supporting extremely low-income households, very low-income households, that we can provide operating subsidy as part of this program to make sure that those units can continue to be operated. And I think I have one more. Oh yeah, this is the slide everyone always asks about, which is when can I get the money, right? Which is exactly what we're concerned about. So because it's so new, it's taken a little while to develop this program, but we are close to an exciting milestone. We are likely to release draft guidelines for public comment next month, so look forward to hearing folks' thoughts on those. We're gonna release our request for proposals for fund managers, if all goes well, in June, and then this fall we should have the program guidelines finalized and the fund managers selected to get funds out the door. And with that, I will pass it to Andres.
Great, and I'm going to go ahead and time myself because otherwise I might start rambling. But yeah, so let me this over. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here today, and good morning to everyone, and glad to be here with this wonderful panel. It's great to hear about the great work that's being done at the local level and state sort of implementation work of some important pieces of legislation that have been enacted over the past year or so, or a couple years. So I just want to talk a little bit about some upcoming opportunities for the state to play a larger role, you know, in the building that's somewhat behind us, in the state capitol, over the next, well, really over this year, in terms of legislative opportunities that advocates are working around. Now, we heard a little bit from Stephanie about, or a good deal from Stephanie about SB 1079 and the FIPP program. And so those have been some recent pieces of legislative action that have made some significant progress, and are making progress when it comes to preservation. And so the work isn't done, and it continues, not only in the implementation, but also in the legislature. There are some current pieces of legislation and budget proposals that we're working on to try to advance the agenda even further when it comes to funding, preservation projects, and also making it easier for tenants and mission-driven nonprofits to be able to have an opportunity to acquire, preserve, rehab, because I think we've kind of heard a bit of a theme. You need the money, you need the resources, but you also need the ability, the chance to be able to acquire the property, to be able to even preserve it at all. And so I think with those sort of dual needs, there's some pieces of legislation that are currently, that we're working on through the Stable Homes Coalition that Justine referred to earlier, which is co-convened by Housing California, Public Advocates, and Enterprise, to try to make some significant advances in this space. So I'm just going to go over a few of them, and you know, it's not a full comprehensive look at every bill in the legislature relating to preservation, but just really want to highlight some ongoing opportunities for folks to engage over the next few months. Hopefully a few months, hopefully they advance through the process successfully. But just wanted to provide an opportunity to highlight how we can further engage on preservation, anti-displacement work in this area. So first, I'm going to jump into CAP, the Community Anti-Displacement and Preservation Program. So this would provide a funding source for mission-driven organizations to work to prevent displacement by financing acquisition of unsubsidized rental housing, or NOAA, as it's also known, so that they can be preserved as affordable homes. So there's many similarities, I would say, with FIPP in the sense that it's creating sort of a funding source. It's a bit broader since it's not limited to homes that are at risk of foreclosure or in a foreclosure process. It's a much broader ability in terms of unsubsidized rental housing. It would create a partnership with HCD as well, with CDFIs, to basically sort of run that program in the provision of short-term acquisition capital, and which can then be converted to long-term public subsidy. So, you know, we're really excited about CAP. It's gotten a lot of momentum, a wider range of support. Our budget champion is Assemblymember Richard Bloom. We're feeling really good about CAP's chances getting it into the budget this year. For folks who work in the Capitol or in the Capitol community, you know that the budget process can be a little bit of a black box to fully understand. You know, budget requests don't have the same kinds of hearings that bills do. And so it can be a little unclear how to engage and how to support. I would really recommend for folks who want to engage on CAP to contact us, myself, Justine, our friend Jack from Housing California, basically getting as much support from the most number of legislators is really what we're trying to do right now, so that the leadership in both the houses of the legislature and in the governor's office recognize the importance of a critical preservation, this critical investment in preservation that is needed. And just a few numbers, you know, we estimated that it would basically, over the lifetime of the program, would basically preserve about 4,500 homes as affordable, serving almost 50,000 households. So can make a significant impact if we're able to get this kind of funding that's so critically needed. The next thing I would highlight, and this isn't one of, this isn't coming out of Stable Homes, but this is coming out of one of our very close partners with the California Community Land Trust Network, AB 1837. And so this is actually a follow-up to SB 1079 that we talked about earlier. And really, I just wanted to highlight this because it's actually strengthening SB 1079 by sort of closing up some loose ends, strengthening the enforcement ability to make it a reality, and also extending the life of 1079's provisions. You know, there's been a lot of concern of sort of the implementation of 1079, where, you know, some of those bad players are finding ways to get around 1079's provisions using nonprofits who are eligible under 1079 to take advantage of sort of the acquisition provisions so that they can acquire properties, or taking advantage of sort of having folks sign affidavits and things of that nature that they are sort of legitimate bidders when they really weren't. And so there have been a few instances of this occurring, and this bill would sort of close up those loopholes, make sure that 1079 is meeting the purpose that it was enacted to accomplish, and also give folks more time. As we saw with Stephanie, you know, getting everything rolled out can sometimes take a while. And, you know, 1079 was passed a few years ago. FIPP was passed last year, but it's not going to be until sort of the end of this year that, you know, things are going to be more fully set up. And so we don't want this to sunset before communities have had enough time to really take advantage of this important law and the funding that has now been approved for it. So 1837 is really important to make sure that it stays on the books, those sort of loose ends get tied up a little, and we have more time to make it a reality. Another bill that I would highlight, and this is also sort of coming out of Stable Homes as well with CAP, is AB 2710 by Assemblymember Ash Kalra. And so this is what we would call like a TOPA-COPA bill. Lots of acronyms. TOPA-COPA, which are both forms of ROFO, right of first offer. Yeah. So a Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act or Community Opportunity to Purchase Act, which is basically, it's very similar to, like with 1079, a sort of right of first refusal sort of situation, but this is combined with a right of first offer and a right of first refusal on the back end. And so essentially giving tenants and qualified entities such as mission-driven nonprofits, that would also include local agencies, government agencies, being able to essentially get a first opportunity, a first chance, a little bit of a leg up to make an offer when a rental property is going to be put up for sale. And it doesn't require the owner to accept that offer, but it's really giving tenants and nonprofits an ability to, you know, get their information together, try to secure financing, and just give a little bit of a leg up so you have that opportunity. Now, the property owner could always reject the offer and accept it from a third party, but then that's when the right of first refusal kicks in. And if the tenants or the the other qualified entities are able to match that offer, then they would acquire the property. In no case would the owner have to accept anything less than, the best offer, or have to sell the property if they didn't want to. They could just say, I'm not going to sell this, and this doesn't force them to. So once a property would be acquired, it would be preserved as permanently affordable. There would be built-in protections for the tenants, including current tenants. We don't want this to be used as a tool for displacement of folks using this policy to acquire properties and then evict everyone. Absolutely not. So there's protections built in place. And really, this state bill is really modeled and built after a lot of local policies that are already on the books, or at least a handful, such as in San Francisco that already has a COPA. Washington, D.C. has a TOPA, and local communities throughout California, such as Berkeley and Oakland, San Jose, East Palo Alto, LA County, are all at some different stage of a local TOPA or COPA campaign, and though they haven't yet been enacted into an ordinance, there's a lot of groundswell and support on the ground to really raise this issue up. And so the state bill is really an attempt to bring that to the state level, and not supplant the local work and the local ordinances, but really create sort of a statewide baseline that then locals could build on top of. So really excited about that. It's definitely going to have a heavy lift in the legislature, and this is the second version of the bill. Came out a first time a couple years ago, and a lot of the sort of usual suspects coming out to oppose it. But this is something that we're certainly excited to start the conversation around at the state level, and would love for folks to continue to engage. It's going to be up for its first committee hearing in a couple weeks, so would certainly love to see folks engage and learn more about this. And then the last one, and this is another stable homes sort of priority, is SB 490 by Senator Caballero, and this relates to technical assistance. So in addition to having sort of legal process on the books in the law where tenants and nonprofits get that leg up that they need to be able to get an offer in there and the funding to make it a reality, is also, well, how do you navigate the system? And that's where technical assistance comes in. FIPP does provide for some technical assistance in the funding. CAP similarly would have a certain percentage that would allow for technical assistance related to CAP. SB 490 creates sort of a standing technical assistance program within HCD. It would be contingent on appropriation by the legislature, but essentially wouldn't be program specific in terms of CAP, FIPP, whatever it may be. It would sort of be a standing sort of pot and program to be able to support technical assistance for acquisition rehab projects. So really excited about that, and it has advanced pretty, maybe I should say under the radar in the legislature. It seems pretty non-controversial, so really excited about that making it across the finish line this year. So would also encourage folks to engage on SB 490 as well. So those were just some highlights. Again, not the full scope of any bill related to preservation in the legislature, but a few ones that I think are really exciting that would, I think, further the work that we've heard about today, and upcoming opportunities for all of us to engage in that this year in this legislative cycle over the next few months. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our panelists for sharing with us. It's exciting to, hear from kind of very local specific examples and what the state is already doing to get more engaged in this work, and of course, some exciting opportunities for this legislative session. So we have a few questions for our panelists, and we're also hoping to get all of you to speak up a little bit in this space as well. I'm going to be doing my best to kind of run around a little bit with the mic, so let's see how that goes. So the first question I have for our panelists, and I'm inspired a little bit by the opening remarks this morning, but how you see preservation and anti-displacement efforts as part of addressing racial equities in our housing system, And I would add on to that, there was a lot of discussion this morning about how housing is also seen as a climate justice strategy. And so I'd invite each of you to speak to that piece as well. Does anybody want to kick us off? Roberto, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the way community land trusts have been growing in LA County has been a really great example. The five of us are concentrated in what we know neighborhoods that were highly redlined. They're segregated, and the poverty levels are really high in the neighborhoods we live in. And so for us, it's really around expanding the infrastructure that's already there and creating new pathways for it. And so for us, when we five years ago around in affordable housing in East LA, we were talking about having more affordable housing in the neighborhood. Now we're talking about community ownership of affordable housing in the neighborhood. And we're talking about wealth building in ways where the single family home is no longer available for our neighborhood because of the increase of housing prices. And so for us, it's how does the community land trust work with the community development corporation like Little Tokyo Service Center or the East LA Community Corporation or many of the other CDCs in our neighborhood to say well then how do we create limited equity cooperatives to address wealth building in our community? How do we create other forms of ownership that are not the single family home? And then how do we also create access for undocumented folks to have access to this type of housing? And so for us, that's the work that we're doing. And a lot of the community land trusts are really kind of pushing it in terms of saying, well, we're here. We're here to create pathways. We're led by the folks who live in the neighborhood. And even the governance structures of our community land trusts are built for the community input and democracy in terms of who gets to be part of the decision-making of the future infrastructure of our neighborhoods. And so we're talking about land banks. We're talking about, the grant funding, that how do we steward and control the grant money from the state and the federal government and from philanthropy in ways that really kind of innovate the affordable housing landscape.
I just want to add quickly to that it's, when it comes to racial equity, it needs to be more than just reinvesting or redirecting resources. It really has to be about returning agency to these, neighborhoods, BIPOC communities. And I actually do want to commend HCD and Stephanie in particular on the FIPP program. Because of the extent to which she has been listening and she has been present. And, I think what we've been striving to do differently with this HCD program is we're looking to create that flexibility, right, for local communities, for Black and brown communities to be able to say, hey, I know what's best. I know intimately how the housing crisis and the homelessness crisis and that push and pull between the need for affordable housing and desire to build wealth, all of these issues affect my community in particular. And, we can work together if, you trust us to do this. And I think that's what's a little bit different about this program. It's not just about capital, quick access to capital, although those are all also things to work on. But it's about agency, and it's good policy.
Wow, well said. I don't think I have anything to add beyond what Roberto and Debbie just said. Thumbs up.
Okay, I would just say ditto. I think what's great about these policies is, again, empowering, I think, the communities that are at the center that are most affected, and I think that's the perspective we need to have, and how we try to create these programs, these policies, so that it's centering the people who are most affected rather than just coming down on high. So yeah, nothing else to add.
Thank you both. Thank you all. I'm going to ask one more question of the group, and then I'm going to turn to all of you to see what questions are in the audience. So get thinking on what those questions are. I'm going to jump around a little bit, just being thoughtful about time. So what we've talked about today is really, what's happening locally, but also new work and new opportunities for the state to get involved. And I'd be curious to hear from each of you what you see as any tensions and considerations that we should really be holding at the forefront as we're asking the state to get more involved in this work, which has been really rooted in local efforts to date. Who would like to take that one first?
Well,
Thank you, Andres.
Yeah, I think one thing that I would say is important is elevating, I think, preservation work as being a key component of addressing the housing crisis. I think a lot of the narrative is focused around build more, and there's a lot of conversation around supply. And while that needs to be part of the equation and a central part of it, I think making sure that decision makers understand that preservation is a way of increasing the supply of affordable housing that we need more of. And that's really where the crisis lies, and that's where it lies with the most disadvantaged communities in our state. So I think making sure that it's part of the conversation and that decision makers understand that it's not just a production question, it's also preservation, and preservation is an integral piece of that. And also there's a lot of urgency around homelessness. And I think making the connection to homelessness is, I think, really critical, because I've certainly seen in the Capitol that has a lot of sort of a stronger sense of timely urgency around that issue as well. And they're not disconnected. They go hand in hand. And I think making that clear and making clear the role that preservation plays is critical. So that's something that I would want to lift up.
Anyone else like to add on considerations and tensions as the state is dipping its toe into supporting this work?
Yeah, I think just adding on to, I think preservation is a really key way. It's like thinking about TOPA and COPA as like key ways of really taking into consideration tenants as potential like homeowners through like buildings. And it's really like, it really shifts a lot of agency to tenants versus like the way we build affordable housing sometimes, where we just kind of like find the cheapest lot we can get and then have the conversations with the tenants or like the neighbors around affordable housing, which I'm all down. Like, we need more affordable housing, but at the same time, it's like we really need other forms to really take into consideration like very low income tenants, to really kind of decide, what they want in the neighborhood. And I think COPA TOPA is like a really great example. And then also like just to expand on that in terms of like who's in the room right now is like, I think I've seen a lot of tension in the past around like we're all kind of trying to compete for the same resources. And I think one of the really cool things I've seen in LA is that we're actually building partnerships like among CDCs, and then the CLT-CDC relationship has sometimes been like very dismissive that community land trust is a form of building affordable housing. And so for us, it's like really been extremely helpful, and we've really taken the guidance of CDCs of saying like, well, let's build these partnerships to kind of start being innovative, instead of kind of like dismissing each other or like just staying on our track of what our pipeline is or what it like all those other things. And it's just speaking amongst like peers, and I think, but it's really important around the policies that really do hold accountability and the infrastructure.
Yeah, I agree. I think it matters a lot who is doing the developing, and not just in the sense where you're being engaged as a stakeholder, but you are at the table and you're working together actively. And I think that, you know, just again, I think going from the local to the state, it's always a little bit of a transition. But, you know, I just want to say again, to the extent that this FIPP program has tried to take a lot of the lessons learned about what works at the local level and adapt it at the state level is quite innovative. And you know, we wish for the great success of this program. And I think that's why, I mean, look at us. We're literally all here at the table.
I want to open it up for questions from the audience. Myself and Jack will be going around. I know you had your hand up even earlier, so I'm going to pop over here. And if you can just introduce yourself, your name, and if you're here with an organization, before you ask your question, please.
Hi, my name is Tanya Love. I'm Chief of Staff for Councilmember Carol Fife. We are working, you know, on TOPA legislation locally, and some of the pushback that we gotten around limited equity is particularly from Black residents who are concerned that they're not going to have access to full equity. So wondering if you've had some pushback around that, and if there's been some sort of pathway towards full equity for those who are participating in community land trusts, or what are some mitigations that you've negotiated?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard a lot about the Berkeley, Oakland horror stories. If that's what you're referring to. Yeah, it's, you know, I think it's, again, I think community land trusts still have, and affordable housing developers still have a lot of education, like community education, like in a way that really kind of, one, like the numbers speak for themselves. Like, so like accessibility to single family homes specifically in the Bay Area, I mean, like it's a laughing joke. Like, you know, like even if you grew up in a middle class family, like you still don't have access to the housing market. And so in terms of like Black and brown people, like it's even worse. Like it sucks. Like my parents live in San Jose. And they're like, when are you moving back? And I'm like, probably never. Like, and so for me, like, I think we're still being fed, and maybe this is like for the banks out there and the CDFIs out there, like around like real like education around, like homeowner program, like first time home owner programs are awesome, but like let's get real. Like, are we going to go to Oklahoma or Ohio, like, to implement these first-time homebuyer programs, or are we like going to work with like COTs and CDCs to really build out alternatives, and then work to and go to policymakers and really demand the programs that we need to really implement these like new alternatives, like limited equity cooperatives. And if we think about the infrastructure and the capacity building that exists statewide around these like alternative programs, it's zero. We're having conversations with the community, like the California COT network, around how do we even implement the capacity building and training for COTs across the state to just have an idea of like, how do you even do it? And so I think there is like a lot of need around like the type of capacity building that exists across the state to really make these like alternatives viable. Because we're like, California is like behind. Like if we think of New York City, if we think of the state of New York, we think of the state of Vermont, you know, that have like really good like programs that fund community land trusts and limited equity cooperatives, and the partnerships that they have with financial institutions are things that we need here. And so in a lot of ways, like I get the pushback, but I think there's like a lot of like there's so much potential for organizing at a local level, at a state level, to really kind of build out this like capacity building that we need. But yeah, I agree. Like if if I'm trying to convince someone who benefited from buying a home to let go of equity, it's going to be really hard. But that's why we need a lot of folks to start kind of talking about the issue in different forms and coming from different forms. We need it to come from the state. We need our elected officials to recognize how hard it is to buy a home and that we need to create an alternative that's no longer the single family home. And we need to understand that limited equity is equity and that it is generational wealth. And that it's like actually sharing more wealth with the community versus just pocketing it into like one family. And so in a lot of ways, like I think those are kind of like, at least that's my take on it. But I understand the pushback, and I understand that actual narrative of like losing to like limited equity versus full equity is actually coming from like, it's coming from the opposition that doesn't want to see it done. And so we have to recognize that like that we need to neutralize that, and I think there's different ways of neutralizing it, and it could be done like, and it could be coming from all sorts of levels, because it's not we're not competing over ideology. We're really just trying to make sure that more people are taken care of in the neighborhood. And so yeah, I think that's my kind of share on it, but I don't know if folks want to talk more about it.
Andres, did you want to add anything about how that's playing out with the state legislation, or?
Yeah, that issue has certainly come up just sort of more broadly with the state TOPA-COPA bill of, you know, what about opportunities for building wealth through homeownership? And, you know, I certainly don't have as much experience directly as the folks on the ground. I guess the one thing that I would just sort of add is, you know, I think what might allow folks to be able to build an ability to get into homeownership is the fact that you're living in an affordable place where you're not being gouged. And now if you're truly paying an affordable rent, no more than 30% of your income, well, maybe you can save up for the down payment so that you can own a home. And so it's similar with being a renter, where maybe you're not building equity, but if you're just scraping by because the rent's too damn high, then when are you going to have an opportunity to become a homeowner and start building that equity? So while the model might not necessarily be oriented around building equity through homeownership and building wealth, I think it could certainly help it in sort of that longer term way, because everyone benefits when all your income isn't going to just surviving, and you can finally actually save so that if you no longer want to live in a permanently affordable deed restricted housing, that that's great. But maybe now you actually will have been able to save up for that down payment. So that's just maybe one perspective that I would throw into, but again, I don't want to say that that's the end all be all to that question.
Yeah, and just to add to that, like, if we think about the infrastructure, like, for instance, like we were trying to do a limited equity new construction, and unfortunately, like every bank that we went to laughed at us because they wanted to securitize the land. And it's like, no, like the land is going to be perpetually affordable. It's going to be split. And so they're like, so we're not going to fund your construction loan on a limited equity development. And so, where do these CDFIs get their funding? And then how do banks create the restrictions on the loans for affordable housing development? And so how do we start advocating for those changes as well to really be able to use the funding that CDFIs get for the build out of a new way of building housing that uses limited equity cooperatives, that uses shared housing models, that uses like tenancy in common, mutual housing associations, like all these forms of housing that are really underfunded, and like California just doesn't have the infrastructure for it right now.
Other questions? Okay, I'm going to pop around a little bit.
Thanks, Justine. Hi, Craig Edelman. I'm with Lassar Development Consultants. We work around the state. Thank you all for sharing your experience on this. I'm interested in the sustainability and scalability of some of these models, and what type of resource investment, maybe on a metric per unit basis or per home basis. I think particularly the FIPP program, I'm curious, I think you heard I heard 500 million. Do you have a number of homes you're targeting with that amount? And just curious how, you talked a little bit about the comparison with other state programs. How does the cost and investment compare? And over time with this model compared to our more traditional affordable housing models, which aren't necessarily particularly scalable or sustainable in and of themselves, where are we going to go with this to solve the problem at scale?
Yeah, I mean, you're asking the right question, right? Like, how can we bring this work to scale? And I kind of feel like FIPP is this pilot of trying to bring things to scale, right? Like piloting the scale concept. That's what we're doing here. So, yeah, in terms of the numbers, I was delighted to see Andres' numbers in terms of, what does he think $500 million of AC rehab will get over a period of time, right? And thinking about, how much of that funding can and can't revolve. I think for me, there are still a lot of open questions, right? In terms of what will the cost be? And the cost for these projects can vary greatly, right? Like, it is amazing that Debbie did this project for $250,000 a unit. That's wonderful. I think that's probably on the lower end of what these projects will be. It looks like you're agreeing, right? So, and then there's this question of, well, can some of the funds revolve? So, FIPP is about not only small scale rental, but also, affordable home ownership, right? So if you have ownership properties, especially like a single family home, which you're keeping affordable for the long term through a CLT, but selling to low income home buyers, when they bring in their mortgage, some of that funding can revolve. We'll be able to use that on future projects. I don't know how much, right? So it sounds like someone else did a better job of making assumptions about how much funding can revolve over time. So yeah, I don't even have a total estimate or a goal, because I want to see this as a pilot and see what's the variance and what are we going to get out of it.
Hands high. I'm going to turn it over to Jack to ask a question that came through the chat.
Thanks, Justine. A question from Jessica on the chat is, are retrofits and rehab projects a priority for CLTs once properties have been preserved?
Are rehab projects a priority?
After properties have been what?
After properties have been acquired? Yes. It generally depends on the capital needs of the property. Often these NOAA properties do need some love, but every once in a while you do get lucky, and you can work with what you have. We don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So, the good thing about some of the older properties is, as long as it is, in a certain threshold of livability, or above that, you are grandfathered in on certain requirements, code requirements, and you don't, you can work with what you have. So in those instances, you do the rehab you need to do. You do the repairs, you put in the reserves, you plan for the long haul. But for those projects that need a moderate to substantial rehab, then we do have to plan for something shortly after acquisition.
Hello. Hi. My name is Tani Macedo. I am here with the California Department of Housing and Community Development. I used to serve on a local commission for a housing agency. My question is a little bit related to the barriers that you mentioned around financing, but what are some of the best practices you've seen to gain local agency support or recognition of land trusts that could be taken away for other groups to, start working in this area?
Yeah, So what are strategies to uplift community land trusts? Is that in terms of, is that what I'm hearing?
Gain local agency support.
Oh, gain local, okay, so, back in the day in LA, community benefit agreements are really good because you get a lot of money, and and Trust South LA was built out that way through the fight at the Staples Center. And so, they're just getting some of that funding, but it's been like 15 years. But it worked, and it worked. And there's a community land trust in South Central LA, specifically because of the community benefit agreements and the fight of anti-displacement. And so that's a really clear example. We've engaged with the county, specifically in District 1, which we work in a lot, which is Hilda Solis. And before we worked on this pilot program, we were part of a Transformative Climate Communities grant. And at the time, it really created and this is like pre-pandemic, it really helped us build out the infrastructure we needed for the work that we're doing now. And so that's a really clear example of how you could work with a public agency. And part of that TCC grant funded the expansion of the community land trust into unincorporated East LA. So post that planning grant, was it planning grant? I forgot the difference between both of them, but post that, Hilda Solis was, and our office was like just really knowledgeable of a community land trust, and there was a lot of trust in terms of being able to fund the pilot program. So that's how we that's like another example of how we've implemented local strategies to work with elected officials and public agencies. And then I see Liz here, I don't know, or someone from LACTA, and the relationship we've been able to build with LACTA has been really helpful in terms of being able to implement the program. And so it takes time, at least in LA County, we've been working on this for the last 10 years or 15 years since Trust South LA was formed to address the issues that were happening in South Central LA. And so just to say that there's a variety of strategies around and the two ones that I've just said is working on community benefit agreements around anti-displacement campaigns. And the other one is looking at state grants that help you build partnerships between CBOs and the county or the city that you're working in.
I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions.
Hi there, I'm Michael Raley. I'm a senior project manager with Mercy Housing. As Stephanie mentioned, a large nonprofit like the one that I work for is not likely to be engaged in the kind of work that you're doing. But to be perfectly candid, the tax credit program is fundamentally broken, as anyone who's tried to do a project in recent years can attest. And furthermore, the tax credit program does very little about the fundamental problem of the cost of being alive. It doesn't get to the root of the problem in the way that your work seems to. So my question is, what can a large nonprofit do to bring its resources to bear to help advance your work? I understand that there are compelling reasons to keep this work centered on local organizations, but do you see a role for a larger nonprofit in helping local groups to advance their work?
Yes, actually, one of the CDC CLT partnerships involves Brilliant Corners, which is one of those larger regional nonprofit developers that you speak of. And Brilliant Corners in Vanessa Luna in particular has been an incredible resource for the CLTs. And I think the type of resources and the type of both in terms of capital to get things going, and in terms of manpower and people power. It's, I think those are resources that larger nonprofits are able to bring uniquely to this type of work. But, like Roberto said, I would emphasize the partnership. It all comes down to, the ability to work closely and together meaningfully with the CLTs and the other community organizations. So it's how you do it, but it works.
And then if y'all want to know more about CLT CDC partnerships, there's a workshop tomorrow at 2:30, I think.
Get that plug in.
Yeah. So it'll be a really good developer CLT partnerships. And so Debbie and I will be on the panel and we'll talk about the LA CLT partnerships, but there's going to be folks from across the state as well, kind of talking about what those partnerships could look like.
All right, I think we have time for maybe one more question before we do a wrap up.
Hi, my name is Doris Freeman. I'm from the Bay Area, Oakland. I work with Operation Dignity, and I'm a homeless outreach program manager. I worked with Riley Wilkerson before, who was the HCD community development manager. And my question is, how can we help with our organization to help the clients that we serve? Because a lot of times it's always focused on the single housing families with the one persons with more families. We work with a lot of singles, and a lot of the persons that we work with, they can use opportunities such as that when they get large lump sums of money, such as like SROs or single homes. So how could we help and be a part of trying to provide that education towards the people that we work with, and what resources that can help benefit our clients that we serve in the Bay Area, Alameda County.
Someone want to take that?
I can't speak too much to the Bay Area, but I will say in Los Angeles, every neighborhood is different. In East LA, where Roberto and I have done this pilot, there are a lot of families, in the neighborhood, but in another neighborhood I work with, we did acquire NOAA properties that are SRO, and we do have, these tenant populations. A lot of folks are, I think they would qualify and could be categorized as at risk of homelessness. And how do we work with our residents? And some of them have lived in our buildings for 15, 20 years. So how do we work with, these residents who similarly want to stay in place and want to continue to, be housed and live affordably? How do we work with them on long-term solutions? I think that's something I'd be happy to talk to you about.
Well, we're almost running out of time here, so I want to give each of our panelists a chance to say one or two sentences. We're here in Sacramento. There are folks involved in the legislature in the room, and I'd love to just ask you all, what's one thing that you would love our elected officials, our state government to have in mind, whether that's just a priority of yours, something that you want them to hold close as they're making decisions. And I know, Stephanie, for you, that might be about what it means to be an implementer, but we'll let folks kind of go down the line. Roberto, if you want to start, we can come back this way and wrap things up.
I think the policies that we covered today, I don't know if we could just show them one more time so you could walk away with those. And I think things we said today were, at least on the ground, is how do low income or houseless folks really are taking into consideration around being decision makers, specifically around the creation of affordable housing. I think that's like really important for me. And then the list of opportunities that are really helping us build out the infrastructure we need.
Thank you, Roberto. Debbie?
I would say create more programs on, the local, the state, the federal level that are large sums of capital, but also flexible capital that makes its way to the right folks, and really agency. I want to emphasize agency again, provides agency to local communities.
And as a state implementer, I will turn it over to you folks. My job is to make sure that this program works for the people on the ground who are living in these homes and doing the work and organizing themselves. So my door is open. Give me a call. You all have my contact information from the slides, and I need to hear from you to make sure I'm doing it right.
Yeah, and like I said before, I would emphasize making it clear to our decision makers that preservation is a key component of the solution, to stabilizing our communities, protecting renters, increasing the supply of affordable housing. And yes, please support each of these bills, budget asks. We want to make sure that Stephanie has plenty of work to implement once we get these enacted. So I would leave it at that.
Can I get a final round of applause for all of our panelists? Thank you all so much. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. And feel free to stick around and ask questions and hang out. And we'll see you at lunch.